But talking about clean water funding, who doesn't know more than that? And our next presenter, George Hicks from the Connecticut Department of Energy and Environmental Protection. He's the supervising sanitary engineer from the Municipal Water Pollution Control Section. George has worked at DEP for 26 years. In the MWPC section, he supervises staff engineer for the planning, design, construction, and financing of upgrades to municipal sewer treatment plants and wastewater collection systems. He develops the Clean Water Fund priority list, and he has served as hearing officers for the priority list since 2008. George has a Bachelor's of Science in Engineering from UConn, and he is a licensed professional engineer in the state of Connecticut.
Thank you, Dennis. While I'm here, I'd like to introduce a couple other staff members from our office, Denise Ruzicka, our division director, and Roland Denny, who is my counterpart. I'm just going to hit on 4 topics today. Some of them are relevant to a number of the people here in the audience. American iron and steel. Now, that's a requirement of all Clean Water Fund construction contracts. That's been a requirement dating back to the Water Resources and Reform Development Act of 2014. Last month, I was contacted by EPA headquarters. They have decided to do what they call informal outreach visits to the state of Connecticut, and that's going to be next month. So they asked me to supply a list of the various projects that we have underway, and I managed to shorten the list down to anything that started construction up to 75% complete. So that's the list. There's 18 construction contracts that are targets, basically, of having this audit. They're organized alphabetically. I'm not sure you can actually see it, but I don't think that's really all that critical at this point. So the issue is, what can you do to prepare for this? Now, before they show up, they're either EPA headquarters or their contractor, Cadmus, should be notifying you. You should get a call from them, and they should coordinate the visit. So things you can do is you can go to our website. We've got a number of documents on there, whether it's our American Iron and Steel memo, there's an EPA document on frequently asked questions, and then they have an EPA PowerPoint training presentation, which is excellent. It kind of explains the process, and it takes you through where they're going to go. But for any of these projects, you really need to have updated project files. You need to have, all your certifications up to speed and up to date, and you really need to develop your de minimis list. So for the certification letters, that's the standard items, the product, where it was made, who it was delivered to, and a signature by a representative of the company. De minimis, well, that's on a lot of these projects, particularly treatment plant upgrades, you've got thousands of small items that are very low cost. And sometimes determining the origin of manufacture can be very difficult. You're talking about, screws and fasteners and washers and tubes and wire and that sort of thing. So they all fall under de minimis. You don't have to chase it down, but there are limits on it of up to 5% of the materials incorporated into the job and no more than 1% for a single item. So you really need to make sure that your project files are in good shape in that regard. So as I understand it, when they come in, there'll be an educational component. They'll talk about why they're there. They'll talk about American Iron and Steel. They'll then go through to look at your project files. Then they'll go out to the site. They'll look at any stockpiled materials. And in the end, they're going to file a report on what they found, and they'll send the report to our office. So I just say, do the best you can on this, and we'll see where it all falls out. Nitrogen credit exchange. We recently published the draft nitrogen credit buyers and sellers list for 2018. We now have just moved that to a final, which hasn't really changed that much. And a number of you guys, probably in particular the WPCAs, are wondering, well, what happened in 18? I look back at 17 versus 18, and in 17 a lot of you guys were actually sellers. You're getting money back from the program, and then 18 you're paying in. Some of them actually, you're buyers to begin with, and then you're paying 3 times that amount in 2018. So, it's really a reflection of, what happened with the weather. That's our opinion up in Hartford, but, the operators, I'm sure, know exactly what happened. So, this table is a 5-year look back into the program. And in general, everyone has done really well. The state's limit is at the bottom for, how much loading can go to Long Island Sound. And if you look at the table in red, those are the 2 years we didn't meet the goal. But basically, everyone did great in 14, 15, and 16. We didn't meet it. We missed it narrowly in 2014 by 3% and by 8% last year. Now, as you may recall, back in 2016, this program moved to self-sufficiency. And what that means is the state isn't going to subsidize any of the cost that is paid to the sellers. So the way it works is the buyers pay into the pool, and all that money is distributed back to the sellers based upon performance. So if you'll notice, the buyer and seller credit costs for 14 and 15 were identical because that was prior to the passage of the Public Act. And after that, it's different based upon how much money is coming in for the buyers. So for instance, in 16 and 17, you guys are all doing great. There weren't a lot of buyers. We met the TMDL, and the payments to the sellers were fairly small. That all changed last year, and, likely due to the weather. So we didn't meet the TMDL. A lot of people had to pay in. So we had a lot of money in that pool, which got distributed to the sellers. If you look at, say, the credit cost didn't change much from 17 to 18. It only changed by 7%. But if you look at what came into the coffers on this, it increased by 223%. So, in the end, we have had, the big winner for this coming year, 2018, is Stanford. Now, they typically are the biggest seller in general, but, in the past with Stanford, they were, usually getting about in the 600,000 range. This year it's going to be over $2.5 million. So if you want to find out how that's done, you can go talk to Bill Brink and his staff. Some things you can do as a hedge against this in the future is, you could probably work on I&I. You can try to take some of the, the extraneous water out of your system. We offer funding for that through the Clean Water Fund. It's only a 2% loan. Currently, there's no grant, but, if you had to go borrow the money at, say, 4% versus our 2% over the same term, that's probably the equivalent of around a 17% grant. So there really is a lot of value with our low-interest loan program. Phosphorus reduction. We started this program back in 2009. In the meantime, we've issued all the NIPIS permits with phosphorus limits. A number of these plants have already done their upgrades, so they're meeting the permit limit. This table shows the phosphorus projects that are covered under Public Act 16-57. This list are the projects that qualify these 11 towns. Generally, it's the areas where they have the lowest limit requiring the highest cost technology, and they discharge the most sensitive streams. They end up with this, they get a 50% grant on their phosphorus removal process, but they have a deadline where they have to enter into a construction contract by June 30th of this year. So the top three, they're already done. Those projects are complete. We started construction on the next batch, Plainville, Waterbury, and Southington. I think it was around last year. But we've got a large number of them coming at us right now, the last 5. So Meriden and Vernon recently opened bids, and then within 2 weeks, we're going to have Danbury, Wallingford, and Ridgefield opening up bids on their projects. And if you look at like this last 5 that we're looking at funding, that represents about $360 million of project work. That includes the design and construction costs, because a number of these utilities actually fronted the design costs. Now, on our end, it was a real challenge to keep up with the workload given everything else that we have underway, and these all came in around the same time. And we really relied heavily on the engineering firms working on these jobs to provide more detail and analysis of the contents of those contracts, far more than ever. And it really was a great team effort between, us, the consultants, and the towns. And had it not been for that, I really don't think we would have got these projects out to bid on time to meet that June 30th deadline. So I really want to express my appreciation for everybody that we worked with on those 5 projects, the consultants, and all the engineers that were supporting all this work, and the towns, because they really, it was a level of effort unlike I've actually seen before, and I think everything should work out. They should be able to meet the deadlines, be able to open bids, and then get all proper authorizations from our office to get funded. A little bit about the Clean Water Fund. Over the years, this program has grown significantly, and a lot of it is due to the efforts of the people in this room that have gone out of their way to support the program. Currently, we have $1.1 billion of actively managed projects, 58 funding agreements. We're running over 70 projects in the collection of stages between planning, design, and construction. The majority of the work is in removal of nitrogen, phosphorus, or combined sewer overflows. By the summer, I expect that number will be closer to $1.5 billion. Now, what I expect we'll receive probably in about a month to a month and a half of new Clean Water Fund applications. You've got the 5 phosphorus projects, and I think we may get a couple of smaller MVC projects, but I'm looking at, about $115 million of grant and $265 million a loan. Now, the funds remaining is $10 million a grant and $97 a loan. So our current bond commission request is going to more than sufficiently meet the immediate need. Looking forward to funding everything on the priority list, because there's far more projects that are underway. Some of these projects, the designs are complete, they just haven't moved forward to bid them yet, and there's others that are in process and design. So to wrap up the projects moving forward, just for this priority list, it looks like about $720 million of work. Fortunately, the funding for those projects are in the state's capital budget, the existing capital budget for 18 and 19. And to cover some of that, it's actually covered in the governor's proposed budget for 20 and 21. We were fortunate in the governor's proposed budget that we put forth our capital budget request for the Clean Water Fund program, and the entire request was in his budget. I'm sure if you talk to other state agencies, many of those other state agencies, their program was cut back significantly. But we were lucky in that regard. Now, we do have funding challenges going ahead, and this is kind of a summary of where we've been. For 2012 to 2019, states and bonding at $1.6 billion a year. That's pretty close to the bonding cap of 1.9. Governor wants to shrink the spending by 39%. So that's saying, he really wants to keep it down to annual bonding of $960 million a year. So, there's going to be a lot of competition for, a limited resource. So we'll see how that goes. But fortunately, our program money has already, been embodied in, the majority of these needs are all in the existing capital budget. Now, normally I wouldn't even have any discussion on a contingency plan. Usually, we've got significant excess balance of unassigned money for upcoming projects, and we don't have, a large number of projects hitting us all at once, like I presented in the earlier slide, in particular for the funding for the Phosphorus 5 projects. So I always think it's a good idea to plan for the future, and the future is really, it's right now. What will you do if you have to move your project forward and we just don't have enough funding available to fund your project at that time? Likely it's only an academic exercise, but I think it's good to at least have a strategy in place to deal with that situation. So, really the top item, I think, the way to go is really through bond anticipation notes or bands. That's a short-term funding option that you as a municipality would do, and that would be in place until our Clean Water Fund program is able to fund the project. It's an excellent option, particularly for the projects with that June 30th deadline, those 5 phosphorus projects. It's a good option if you've got a compliance schedule and a permit, or you're working under an enforcement action like a consent order for doing CSO control work. Any costs that associated with acquiring those funds are eligible for our program as loan only, so you can roll those costs into the funding of the project. Typically, the interest rate on bands actually is lower than our construction loan at 2%. I'm not sure where they are now, but they have been very, very low. So you move the project forward, and it actually isn't going to cost you more money, and potentially it can save you a little bit of money. Keep your project on schedule. The one thing I have to say is that if you go down this road, you're going to need a deviation of the Clean Water Fund regulations issued by our commissioner. You need that in order to make this project eligible for grant and loan funding once it is funded. So let's say you've gone ahead, you've got bands, and then, you get bands for maybe a year's worth of funding, and then a couple months into the project, we have full funding restored. What we'll do is we'll enter into a funding agreement with you. So you'll be fully funded. It's just that we can't make the loan component payments while you have bands until they mature. So we would just be paying the grant share until the bands can be taken out by our financing when it matures. Dealing with municipalities that do bands, it's not really that uncommon. In fact, we're financing the Farmington treatment plant upgrade, and for another reason, they went ahead and they did $34 million of bands. So they basically self-financed it, and then, right now we're making the grant payments until the bands mature. So, I think that's a great option if, in fact, we're in a situation where, we don't have enough funding to cover you, but, I can't think back to a point in time where we've actually run into this. So, it would be kind of precedent setting. Generally we get the funding as we need it, and my expectation is that's exactly what's going to happen. But I think it's worth talking to your finance directors about this issue just in case it doesn't. Just kind of a little summary about our program. As I mentioned earlier, the demand for the funding is very high. To wrap up the priority list, we're looking at, over $700 million of additional money. Results in water quality improvements in nitrogen, phosphorus, and CSO control. Creates or retains good paying jobs in the manufacturing, engineering, and construction industry. 21 jobs per $1 million that's an OPM statistic. I've actually seen higher ones. We put out another $700 million on the streets, another 15,000 jobs. This program is really, pretty low cost for the state taxpayer because 70% of the money is paid back to the state with interest. And the program keeps the rates low for sewer users and local taxpayers. So with that, I'd like to thank you all again for inviting me to speak. I hope this presentation wasn't, too much driven by numbers and statistics, but if you have any questions, during the course of the breaks, feel free to either stop by and see me or any of the other people I mentioned from our office. Thank you.